As many of you know, throughout the summer, we've been focusing on some themes related to Brene Brown's series of books. And so today, her book, Rising Strong, is what we've focused on in the month of August. And it's basically about, she writes in it about how we manage the ups and downs and the efforts and failures, the attempts and sometimes the falls of life. On the subject of her third term in the Rising Strong process, revolution, I promised you that last week, she writes, "What's become clear to me in the research captured in this book is that the Rising Strong process can lead to deep, tumultuous, groundbreaking, no turning back transformation. The process may be a series of incremental changes, but when the process becomes a practice, a way of engaging with the world, there's no doubt that it ignites revolutionary change. It changes us, and it changes the people around us." I would argue that Simon Peter's life was that kind of a revolution, a rising strong process that took him from an eager and naive follower of Jesus, a sometimes bold, even reckless disciple, who after various stumbles and falls, start to realize what a life of faith really means. Peter was learning the practice of being a faithful follower. Eventually, he did become the rock on which the present church was built. We know him now as St. Peter, but he wasn't always a saint. The story of Peter that we heard Val read this morning describes one of the many encounters that Peter had with Jesus throughout his ministry. When the disciples see the figure coming toward their boat from across the water, they are terrified and think it's some kind of apparition or ghost. But Jesus calls out to them, "Courage, it's me. Don't be afraid." And it's Peter who stands up boldly and says to Jesus, "Master, if it's really you, call me to come to you on the water." I think it's an interesting response that Peter gives, or a question that he asks. What was he actually trying to do? Was he trying to prove to the others on the boat that he was the strong one? Was he, in fact, just as petrified as the rest, but something in him didn't want to show that fear? Or was he a bit foolish in his boldness? Was it simply bravado? Who knows? But regardless, he steps out of the boat and starts walking on the water toward Jesus. Scripture tells us that somewhere along the way he looks down. We know that's a no-no when you're up high. And he sees the rough waves churning at his feet, and he loses his nerve. And he starts to sink fast. He panics and he cries out to Jesus, "Save me!" And then the story says that Jesus did not hesitate. He didn't leave Peter dangling. He didn't use the situation to prove a point. He didn't make Peter suffer a second longer. Jesus didn't hesitate. He grabbed Peter's hand and brought him to safety in the boat. But Jesus also asked Peter a question. "Faint heart, what got into you?" Faint heart, what got into you? How many times in our lives of faith have we felt like Peter, faint of heart? We know Jesus. Perhaps we've had what we would describe as an encounter with the divine. We have called out to Jesus in our distress and felt God's loving and reassuring presence in our times of need. Yet we also have those moments when we call out and question the situation we're in. We don't always fully trust that things will work out. We have our own ideas of what should or shouldn't happen. We look down, we panic, we're afraid, and sometimes even that fear gets the better of us. We are, in fact, faint-hearted ourselves at times. Simon Peter was a fisherman who lived on the shores of the Sea of Galilee with his wife, his brother Andrew, and his mother-in-law. And it was common for a family like that to work together in their trade, so likely they would have caught and preserved and dried the fish for export to other towns together. And Peter was thought to be in partnership with Zebedee and his sons, James and John, the other disciples who were called to follow Jesus. They were simply living their lives when one day an encounter with an itinerant preacher changed everything. And together they answered Jesus' call to follow him and fish for people. It was Jesus who healed Simon Peter's mother-in-law when she was gravely ill. Peter remained with Jesus throughout his ministry, hearing him preach the Beatitudes, healing the sick, defending the poor, fighting against injustice, speaking to those who were considered untouchable or unclean. One can only imagine what it had been like to witness Jesus' ministry firsthand, how it would change a person's outlook. Encounters with Jesus brought many to faith and transformed lives, and so it was with Simon Peter. It was Jesus who chose to call Simon Peter, which is the Aramaic equivalent of Petros, which means rock. And it was Peter who was the first of the disciples to actually call Jesus the Messiah. Yet it was Peter whom Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan," when he tried to tell the disciples of the suffering he was going to have to endure because of his ministry and the teachings that were being rejected by the established religious orders. Peter himself said to Jesus, "Look, we have left everything and followed you," when Jesus talked about how hard it would be for the wealthy to enter the kingdom. And yet he also says to the disciples that as hard as following him has been, there will be rewards far greater. The many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. At the Last Supper, as Jesus bent down to wash the disciples' feet, it was Peter who objected because he felt he should be washing Jesus' feet, not the other way around. Jesus also spoke of how there were those of his disciples who would scatter and flee when things started to get dangerous. But Peter, again, objected, spoke out, and said he would never desert him. But we know that, in fact, just a few days later, it is Peter who would deny even knowing Jesus, and the reality of that nearly broke Peter's heart. I share these highlights of Simon Peter's life because I think it shows that a life of faith is not always one constant upward ascent the stairs of heaven. There are hills and valleys and bumps on the road for all people of faith. There are times when we feel quite bold and courageous because of our faith, and other times when we are embarrassed to even speak of it to others, and times when our faith seems to shatter, and like Peter, we panic and sink into the churning waves. Peter had defended Jesus when the soldiers came to arrest him at the Garden of Gethsemane, yet he denied knowing him days later. Jesus had said to Peter when he'd fallen asleep while Jesus was off praying that indeed the spirit was willing, but the flesh was weak. I think we can all identify with that. We can have the best of intentions, but often feel we have fallen short and perhaps even berate ourselves because of it. I think what Simon Peter's life of faith reminds me is that we can all have the best intentions and feel inspired, but that we can also feel that we have not met those intentions or lived the life we feel we are called to live. I read the daily Richard Rohr meditations, and this week there was a line in one of his posts that really jumped out at me. It said, "The foundational spiritual question is this: does one's life give any evidence of an encounter with God? When we've experienced union and intimacy with the divine, what is our response?" I think Peter models for us a life of faith that resulted from his encounter with the divine. It led to what Brené Brown calls deep, tumultuous, groundbreaking, no turning back transformation, a series of incremental changes that become a practice, a way of engaging with the world that ignites revolutionary change. It changed him, and it changed the people around him. As a follower of Christ, it was Peter's faith and determination, his ability to rise strong even after the most painful and humiliating lessons of life, that kept him going. One commentary wrote that the central events of Peter's life show a man of both simplicity and faith. He suffered from a common human ailment. He wanted to do and be good, but was not always able to live up to his goals. Nonetheless, Jesus loved and forgave him, because whenever Peter fell, he got up and tried again. The spiritual question I think I need to wrestle with is, does my life give any evidence of my encounter with God? Like Peter, am I willing to drop everything and follow Jesus? Am I trusting enough to step out of the boat? Would I defend Jesus if asked? Would others see in me the changes in my behavior that come from my own encounters with God? Are there incremental changes that are becoming practices that ignite revolutionary changes in my life or the lives of those around me? I pray it may be so. I pray it may be so for each and every one of us. So let the revolution continue transforming our lives and ultimately the world. Let us not be faint-hearted, but be of good courage. Amen.